welcome to Textile Talks. I'm Amy Milne, Executive Director of the Quilt Alliance, and I'm coming to you from Morganton, North Carolina today in the foothills of our beautiful state. Thank you for taking time to join us today, and a special welcome to all those of you who are here for the first time. We're so glad you found us. Please say hi in the chat box and tell us where you're connecting from today. A quick note before we get going, this presentation has some pre-recorded content, so please grab a pair of headphones if you'd like. I'll play the content at full volume and you can adjust the volume on your device for greater control. Textile Talks is a weekly series presented on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern by the Quilt Alliance and our partner organizations, Studio Art Quilt Associates, or SAQA, the International Quilt Museum, and Surface Design Association. All Textile Talks are recorded and available via YouTube. Thanks to our sponsors, credited at the top of the hour, and donors like you. All Textile Talks are free. We'll put the link in the chat now for our donation page. If you're able to make a contribution, we thank you in advance. The Quilt Alliance is the smallest member of our Powerhouse Consortium, but our mission is huge: to document, preserve, and share the stories of all quilts and all quilt makers. Today, we're going to talk about anonymous quilts, those for which the maker is currently unknown, which sadly accounts for the majority of antique and vintage quilts. The Quilt Alliance's vision is no more anonymous quilt makers, and today we're going to learn how to label and document a quilt with no obvious identifying information. First, a quick reminder, please use the chat box for greetings, comments, or tech help, and be sure to use the drop-down menu in the chat box to select everyone if you want to share your message with everyone. Otherwise, it'll just come to panelists. You can use the Q&A box to answer any questions you have for our panelists, who will join us live in the last 10 minutes of the program. And you can turn on live captions by clicking on the live transcript or CC button on your Zoom controls. And don't forget to grab your headphones if you have them, and be prepared to adjust your device volume, since some of our content today is pre-recorded and the volume levels can vary slightly. Our moderator for today's discussion is my colleague and friend, Meg Cox. Meg is a journalist and quilter who serves on the advisory board of the International Quilt Museum. She's also a former president of the Quilt Alliance, serving on the board from 2006 to 2016. A former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal, she currently writes for Quilt Folk magazine and has published her free, awesome newsletter, Quilt Journalist Tells All, since 2008. Meg is also a very skilled moderator, as you'll soon see. Today's panel discussion was recorded last week, and the version that we'll see next was edited for time. In the full-length version of the video, you'll hear about this beautiful quilt shown and whether or not it was made by Meg's great-grandmother, Missouri Valentine, pictured here. Isn't that a great name? We'll share the link to the full-length version of the video in our resource list, and you can also find this video on the Quilt Alliance YouTube channel. Now let's see the recording. And join us at the end for Q&A with our panelists.
Hello, I am so excited to moderate this panel on anonymous quilts because honestly, who doesn't love a good mystery? And we are so lucky because we have 3 of the celebrated 6 know-it-alls on here. And if you are not currently watching the wonderful virtual program that the 6 know-it-alls are doing, well, you should be, I'm just telling you. So I served for 10 years on the board of the Quilt Alliance, and so I know firsthand how hard they work at their mission to document, preserve, and share the stories of quilts and their makers. And we're here today to talk about the makers, particularly the makers that are unknown at this point. And honestly, sadly, that includes the makers of a great many vintage and antique quilts. And so what do you do about those quilts? If you're a curator, if you're a collector, if you're an appraiser, if you're a dealer, what do you do about those quilts where you just don't know who made them and you don't know much about them? How do you label those quilts? Well, we are lucky to have such a great group of experts that can help walk us through the process of doing that. And I am so excited to tap into their wisdom. They are now each going to introduce themselves before we get into the panel discussion. And we are going to start with Lynne Bassett.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Amy, for the invitation to talk with you all today. I'm delighted to be here. And just quickly to let people know about my background, I am a freelance museum curator specializing in historic costume and textiles. I'm just going to focus on the quilts at this point. But a little bit about my background here. I was the curator of textiles and fine arts at Old Sturbridge Village, which is a living history museum that explores the 1830s in inland New England. And there I was responsible for a quilt exhibition called Northern Comfort, which was a book published also by Rutledge Hill Press in 1998, if you want. So that was my first really deep experience with getting to study quilts, and particularly my love for old quilts. I went freelance in 2000, and in that experience, I've done a number of quilt exhibitions, including one for Historic Deerfield, and you might be able to catch the catalog for that if you look online. And then I became the editor and kind of shepherd of the book project for the Massachusetts Quilt Documentation Project. And that was published in 2009. And of course, that was all about documenting quilts across the state. And it was always so exciting to see one that we knew who made it and when and where exactly it came from. After that, I was editor of Uncoverings, the journal of the American Quilt Study Group. And then I became involved in a traveling exhibition and book called Homefront and Battlefield, which was a project with Madeline Shaw, where we looked at the history of the Civil War through quilts and other textiles instead of, just the usual generals and battle strategy and that sort of thing. And another project I was quite proud of was being a contributing author to American Quilts in the Industrial Age from the International Quilt Museum. And that was a great project in taking quilts that may or may not have had some documentation and really pulling information out of them and in deep sort of object studies for each one. So you might look at that for, examples from all of the authors of how they look at a quilt that is documented or not. And then I just wanted to mention this one because you can see this one online. This quilt exhibition is available in a virtual tour on the website of the Connecticut Historical Society. And the great thing about these quilts is that they were all documented. And then my latest is this project for the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut, about various forms of quilts and bed covers in the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, including these marvelous quilted petticoats. And so I end with this petticoat that we see here from the mid 18th century, and she signed it in the quilting, Abigail Trowbridge. And I'm delighted that I now have a book contract to follow up on this project, and I have now discovered who Abigail Trowbridge was. And I am delighted to pass you off now to my friend and colleague, Alden O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. We have been collaborating on things and passing each other photographs and information about objects in each other's collections since her Sturbridge days. So we go back a long way. I am at the DAR Museum in Washington, D.C., which is the museum associated with the Daughters of the American Revolution. So we have decorative arts, a whole lot of period rooms and so on. And among that is the quilts. We have about 320 quilts, quilt tops, both finished and unfinished, and counterpanes, which is what we call the things that are 1 or 2 layers embroidered or pieced or appliqued, but not filled or quilted. And they range from about 1760 or 70 to the 1920s. We mostly don't collect much after about 1900, but a few of them do go there. 2 of my recent exhibits are online. So here are the graphics from those introductory pages, and you can find them at these 2 places. And also, almost all the quilts, we haven't updated the last very few acquisitions are on the quilt index. And also we now have almost all of our quilts, except about 15 or 20 that just don't have very good photographs yet, at collections.dar.org. So you can look those up. There's extensive family history when we know it. The great thing about most of our things being donated by the DAR members, or quite often non-members, but these are quilts that have been in the family for many years, is that the family history has come with that. So, in a way we get to cheat. There's no label on the quilt, but it may have come with history, which we can then research a little more deeply and sometimes debunk, and sometimes say, oh, well, that's actually not the right generation. It must have been a generation before or after. But that's a big benefit of our collection. And I guess, I meant to say my background is more originally clothing and fashion, but that brings me, when I look at quilts, that means that I can often look at the fabrics and say, oh, well, now that looks just like dress fabrics of the 1840s or 50s, or a wrapper fabric from the 1870s. So Lynne and I both, with our fashion history background, bring that into play, as well as, of course, just a general knowledge of women's history and decorative arts history, which all play into looking at quilts that you may not know anything about, that's documented, but you can say, well, the aesthetic of this is very this decade or that decade. So there's a lot of sort of deeper background that plays into this. And with that, I will mute myself and send you over to my friend and colleague, Julie Silber.
Thanks, Alden, and thanks to the Alliance and Amy for inviting us. The 3 of us are good friends and colleagues, and we work together quite a bit. I'm going to share my screen now. Well, like many of my friends and colleagues, I wear several different hats in this little quilt world of ours. And here you can see some of them. I've been a collector of antique and vintage quilts since 1966. I've actually been a dealer since 1970. And here I have some very old photos of my partner, Linda Ruther, with whom I had that shop, from Mary Strickler's quilt from 1972 to 1981. And in between, I was the Quilt Complex, but now I am Julie Silber Quilts as a dealer. And since 2022, I have this brick and mortar shop in Berkeley, California. It's a delight. It was a surprise. And I'm so happy to be able to be back in a shop and meet with people and so on. From 1982 to 1999, I was an official curator, meaning it was an ongoing job at Esprit de Corps, the clothing company in San Francisco. But I've also been a guest curator around the country and around the world, actually, and going into museums on my own with exhibitions that I have put together or exhibitions that I organize of their collections. I'm an appraiser, and in that capacity, I see lots and lots of quilts, and it's my job to document them as carefully as I can. That's a big challenge sometimes and a lot of fun. I'm also an eternal student. I'm a member of the International Quilt Museum and other quilt museums and other museums. I'm a proud member of the Quilt Alliance and other organizations. American Quilt Study Group has been a very big part of my life since I was a charter member in 1980. And here I have learned an enormous amount about quilts, antique and vintage and women's history, in ways that many of you may know, and those who don't know, look into it. It's a wonderful organization, and I urge you to look into it. Quilt friends, lots of quilt friends through the years with whom I share lots of information and joy and entertainment. And since 2020, I'm a member of the Know-It-Alls. There are 6 of us who got together to share what we know about quilts from several different angles. And 2 of my Know-It-All colleagues are here with us today. I wanted to show just a few images of how quilts were documented in the past. We're going to go into that in a bigger way soon, but here's name and date embroidered on the front. On the right, name and date cross-stitched on the back. A very elegant and kind of quiet signature of Joanna M. Dickinson in embroidery. Her date, the date 1853. She was a quiet kind of person. Sometimes it's much more elaborate and exuberant. Sarah McElwain appliqued her letters at the bottom of her album quilt to let us know that she had made it. And one of my favorite quilts in my collection is this one. In these giant letters, Mary Lowcock has let us know that she made the quilt, the date she made the quilt, and where she lived. Last but not least, this is a quilt in progress by Susie Wright, who also gets a prize. On the back of the quilt is a label, and Susie goes all out. In ink, she not only does a beautiful drawing, which she is expert at, but tells us in detail what happened. She saw a quilt many years ago. She never left her mind. She tried to reproduce it. She figured out that the symbols were WCTU and tells us all about that, and then says, created with reproduction fabrics, this recreation matches my memories in every way but size. And the very last, this is a calling card that was attached by thread to the back of a crazy quilt. And in handwriting, Miss Adeline T. Miller wrote, "This is not a crazy quilt. There is method in its madness," made in 1892. Various ways you can document your quilt upon it, and we'll be talking about other ways of doing it as well, and what to do when you don't know anything. So back to you.
Okay, so here we are. I've got some questions for you, and we're going to have some wonderful questions, I'm sure, from the audience at the end. My first question is this. So let's pretend we're in an ideal world, and you have gotten an old quilt presented to you, and you are really excited because you know there's a label on the back. And when you turn over that ideal quilt that you're so excited to read what's on the label, what would be on that label? Anybody jump in?
Well, we start with the name of the maker, and what's really nice is if they actually say made by, because just because a name is on there, it doesn't mean that that person made it. They maybe made it for somebody. I would love to know date, place. You guys jump in.
Yeah, no, name and, date of birth of that person, because sometimes, if you want to go on ancestry.com, you don't know when that person was. I mean, hopefully the date of the quilt will help, but were they 16 when they made it? Were they 60 when they made it? It's going to be decades apart. You want to know where to look for them. Was it made for somebody else? I have an example of a couple of things. I'm going to share my screen again. These two have labels on the back which say made for blah blah in 1879 by his grandma, age 74. Well, that's great, but fortunately these came down in the family, so I know who M.L. Key was, and I know that she was from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. If I hadn't known that, this hexagon quilt gives me no regional clues whatsoever. So how would I have found who that was? John Baltzelke, would be a specific enough name that hopefully we could find him. Martha Maddox, made by her grandma, Martha Harris. It's just not quite enough information. You would like to have it be more specific. And where, tell me in what county in Maryland or Ohio or wherever that it is, so that when we want to flesh out information about these people, we have more to go on.
Can I, go ahead, Julie.
I just wanted to put in that I'm hoping that people coming forward will put as much information as they can in all the kinds of things, including why this is for people working now, why they made it, where they made it, if they worked with somebody else, if it was meant for somebody else, how they felt about it. As historians, just think about put yourself ahead 100 years, and that your quilt is going to come down to somebody who wants to know about it. Tell them everything you want to tell them. Make sure, if you can, to specify what you actually know from what you surmise or how you feel. I'm in favor of put as much as you can on your label for now.
And it may not all fit on a label. So then, maybe you hope that it gets written down and saved in some format that gets saved with the quilt. And you just have to cross your fingers that people whose hands it comes into later will preserve that information.
Well, we should talk at some point, or we should at least note that this information can now be kept electronically. And that's such an important thing that we probably won't talk much about today, but more information could go on a spreadsheet or some kind of, and curators know how to do that, and collectors should learn how to do that. And Lynn, you had something you wanted to add.
Well, if I could share my screen and show so this is a great example of what, it kind of wraps up a number of things that we're talking about. We have the famous Anna Tools quilt. So Anna Tools, her bed quilt given to her by her mother in the year, and she even puts August 23rd, 1785 right there. So that is great documentation, but it doesn't get us over the finish line. Oh, how I wish she had said where she was when she made this, because there's been so much controversy about this bed quilt. Initially, because it was purchased in Maine, it was said to have originated in Maine. Now, as you're talking about with all the digital resources that are available, it's so much easier to do family histories. We can look up the Tools family name, and we find that there's a Tools family in Massachusetts, and there's even an Anna Tools. But is it the Anna Tools? Just because the name is the same does not mean that it's the right one.
Yeah.
And there are other things that you have to weigh when you're looking at this. What is the tradition in the 18th century for making quilts, and who was making it, and why were they making it? Well, they were made primarily, honestly, a special quilt like this. My diary research indicates that they were primarily made at the time of going to housekeeping upon marriage. So that Anna Tools in Massachusetts wasn't getting married in 1785. So I think we still have questions about this. So anyway, I just bring that up as my example of, yeah, it looks really great, but ooh, if we just had a little more information.
Yeah, like that.
I'd like to add one other thing. What do you call the pattern, and where did you get it? Is it your pattern? Did it come from a magazine? Did it come from a kit? Did it come from a whatever? Because, the idea of the diffusion of those patterns, and, who knows how that may change in 100 years. It'll be interesting. And now we say, gosh, we wish those 19th century women had said what they call this pattern, because there weren't a lot of pattern names. So maybe they didn't have a name for that pattern. But if they did, it would be nice to know what it was. And so there's, there's that hole in our knowledge as well.
Yeah. Well, Lynn,
We're
you
not-
brought up something that I wanted to get into a little deeper. And at this point, which is that there's trends in different decades and different centuries about how quilts are made. And there are also trends in how quilts are labeled. So can you give us a little bit about that information?
I wanted to bring to your attention this fascinating book called Marking Time, which really introduces the subject of when and why people started marking their objects, their everyday objects, with names and dates. And this really became a practice in what's called the early modern period, basically the Renaissance, when clocks and watches started to become more available. It just made people more conscious about the passing of time. And it started this trend of marking things. And so we see, for instance, bed rugs of the 18th century are commonly marked with a date and initials of the maker. And you often see items marked in this way. This was made by Phoebe Billings, but it's marked EPB. So that's Ebenezer, her husband, and then Phoebe, and then Billings. So that's how these monograms work. And Mary Foote was kind enough to put her whole name and the date on her bed rug. And then we talked about Anna Tools. But then we get into the period of quilts. Bed rugs kind of fall out of fashion with the Industrial Revolution, and textiles become so common and people start making quilts. And by this time, it's much less common for women to mark their bed covers with their name and date. But we do still see some things. This is Love and Friendship within the heart, and it actually has the date 1806 in it, but she didn't put her name.
Lynn, if you go back for a second here, it
Yeah.
might be worth noting for our audience that quilts are sometimes dated and signed or inscribed in quilting, and it can be difficult to see. So be sure to look very carefully at your quilt. If you have a way of putting the quilt in different lights, you might find something and surprise yourself. It certainly has happened to all of us.
Well, great segue, Julie. Thank you very much. Because that's exactly what happened with this quilt. When I was doing my research and studying the whole cloth quilts, I found this one in the Williamsburg Historical Society, and it was said to come from the Williams family, and that's all they knew about it. And it wasn't until I drew it, I realized that there was a name block up here. And what does it say? It says Submit Gay, 1805. Well, then I got into the genealogy, and she married into the Williams family. So the history was correct, but they didn't know who made it because nobody had ever noticed that name block on there. And then similar sort of thing, LB 1803 on this quilt. But at the time it was believed to have been made in Deerfield, but little research, and turns out it's actually from Conway. So, and then Julie, you know this quilt where we've moved into the federal period and federal Greek revival, where white is the way to go with your bed coverings. And so we see it here worked in the stuffed work. Similar here, it's so much easier to see if it's not just in a single line of quilting, but where it's actually full of batting. It's so much easier to see.
That is awesome. Well, this is what I want to ask you guys next is, so we were talking about some ideal situations. We were talking about some quilts that have a lot of information provided in the labels in various ways. And it's fun and exciting to see that. But say you are given a quilt that is an old quilt and you don't know anything about it. You don't know who made it. You don't know all those things that you do want to know. And so I just, I think it's a very important question to ask. What do you put on the label? I assume you don't leave it without a label. What do you put on the label? And also, is the information different if you are the collector versus a dealer versus a curator? But what would you all put on, try to put on a label in that situation?
I doubt, I'll leap in. I doubt it's very different from any of us. I mean, as a curator, also, I'm not going to put it on a label on the back of the quilt. We have a paper folder still. We haven't completely left the paper world. And we also have our online database. Well, we have things online, but we also have a database that is in-house that has information that doesn't make it to the public about, appraised values and donors information and stuff like that. So we can put more research and more information and, conservation reports and anything that we need to about the history of the object that we've been able to find out before it came to us, or treatment or information about the object while it's been with us. So we don't put all that on a label. So when we talk about labels, in my terms, I'm not talking literally about a label.
On the other hand, I am talking about a label.
Okay.
Or at least a tag. As in my hat as a dealer, I need to give information to the potential buyers. And I do that on my website. When I'm selling a quilt on my website, I put information in the listing. But if I'm selling a quilt in my little shop here or at a show, I want a tag on that quilt that tells the people as much as I know. And if I have more information, I offer to give them either an appraisal that I put together or just the information that they can have and take note of digitally.
I think something that's important that maybe a lot of non-museum people don't know about is what we call provenance. It's the history of ownership of a piece. And I was thinking, in my case, I have one quilt that I purchased, and I bought it from a dealer in Bar Harbor, Maine. And she told me that she got it out of a trunk in an estate sale in Maine. Okay, that's not much to go on, but at least we know that quilt is from Maine. So I need to get that on a label and sew it to the quilts. And I can say I bought this in Bar Harbor in 2007.
Lynn, can I put in a word here?
No.
A dealer told you that, and I don't want to cast aspersions on dealers at all, but I think, wouldn't it be more accurate to say said to have been found in a trunk in Maine? Because you don't know that for sure.
Right.
Yeah. According to dealer. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I want to go on now. And it's great. We've been talking about historic pieces and pieces that come to museums and all of that. But I want to do something for the people who are quilting now, the people who are collecting now, and get into the kind of the technical part of what is your advice for what they should be, not just what they should be, we've been really giving them a lot of good ideas of what information they should be, putting on there for the future, but what are the technical things? What kind of fabrics and materials should they be using that will continue to last? What kind of pens? Because, we're not over here doing our little, cross stitch, insignias. That's not happening now. So given that, the tools that we have at our disposal now, what would you like to see people doing that you think will last?
Alden?
Well, I can say a few words about what I think people shouldn't be doing. Ink smudges, and if people don't know how to use ink on fabric, this is what's going to happen. Oh my goodness, paper attached to quilts, even when it's sewn on. The quilt on the right looks like this label went through the wash, and so we have no idea what it says. The label on the left is wonderful. It's on a quilt top. It has what is supposed to go on, I think. Susan E. Benny, 1885. Remember me when this you see, lest I should be forgotten, your friend. But that's not a very, at all, a very good way to label a quilt. And I'm wondering if you all have something else to say about that.
Well, in the museum world, we use Pigma pens, which are available they're pretty generally available, but the museum sources tend to be like Gaylord or University Products, those sort of places. But I think a lot of quilt shops actually sell them now too. It's an archival quality ink felt tip pen. You can get it in various fineness qualities. And what I would do is write it out on a piece of muslin and sew that to the back of your quilt.
And supposedly that won't run or anything, but I'd probably be inclined to just take it off if I were to wash the quilt, which probably shouldn't be done anyway, because so many dyes will run and things will shrink irregularly and, you know, all of that kind of thing. That's a whole different topic, whether to wash your quilt. Don't put it in the washing machine, whatever you do, for God's sake. Kids, don't try this at home. Consult a professional.
And
Moving on.
can't this be typed on the computer and run printed onto fabric? I don't know much about how technically how that happens.
Absolutely. You can buy these treated fabric sheets and you can write it on the computer and print it on there. And then you also would have the advantage of, you know, a lot of you guys must be trained by now to decipher those script letters that are half faded, because I look at that and I can't make out what it says. But if you did it, you know, on your computer, so that you have a font, you know, you have something that is a little easier to read, that can work. What do you disagree with that, Alden?
I would just say I don't know what's on what substance is on those things. I've bought some of those things, but in order to go through the computer, they're adhered to some kind of paper. I don't know what that adhesive is. I think they're made so that you can iron it onto a quilt. I have no idea what's in that stuff. I don't know what it's going to do to the fabric underneath it or above it or the ink. I don't know if it's washable. I don't know if it's going to destroy that fabric in 50 or 100 years.
Good point.
I would be cautious about it. I would
That's a
rather.
good point. I think some of it you can buy that does have adhesive, but I never get that kind.
Okay.
I get the kind, it has like a clear plastic backing, but it's not, there's no glue, so you can glue it on. I sew it on. But you know, I think anything we do is you have to be cautious, because who knows, you know, I mean, in the next generation or 3 generations after that, what shape is it going to be in? And I think maybe one of the things this argues for, and you all was talking about the bigger curatorial aspect and the different ways that you document things on paper, on databases. And so maybe this is an argument to say to people, how else can you document that? And
and I would suggest that if you're documenting it on paper or I mean digitally, that you put on the label on the quilt some kind of number that refers to what you've put in the computer, so that if people are trying to match it up later, they know what.
I'm also going to tell a slight horror story about a collector of clothing who is a friend of mine. She suffered a very sudden stroke. She had an amazing collection. She had a lot of records from both dealers she had bought things from and stuff she'd bought on eBay. If it was from eBay and she had printed it out, she had, you know, there was a picture, but she had maybe 10 1780s white or off-white embroidered gentlemen's waistcoats. And to find a little thing from a dealer which said embroidered silk gentleman's waistcoat 1780s and not know which of the 10 it belonged to was very frustrating for those of us who were trying to document her collection and its provenance. So, you know, if you're a collector, keep good records so you know what things are. And also, if you have it on your computer, give somebody the password.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
I've got a couple of points, if I could. If anybody has a good old-fashioned typewriter still, some of the nice clearest labels that I have seen in my career have been typed, and the very old-fashioned way, typed onto muslin.
We used to do that
and stitched onto the piece.
Yep. And
The other
then
thing-
PS again, we remove that label if we're washing it
And then the other
and
thing
sew it
that,
back on.
that private collectors and makers might pick up from the museum world is maybe putting a number on a quilt. I mean, they don't have to go through the exact system that museums do, but even starting at 1, 2, 3, if you want to add additional information, then you want to put on a label. You could say quilt number 1, give the basic information,
Yeah.
and then have a notebook or your database or something that you really flesh it out in, so that you don't have, this is my Lone Star quilt, and you have 5 of them or whatever.
Yeah. Yep.
You can
Exactly.
have number 1, number 2, number 3.
Oh, I think that's
Preferably database, because pieces of paper and notebooks get lost.
Oh, wow. So this
Again,
is,
database isn't, if you,
yeah, you guys are giving me a lot of work to do, but you're making me realize that even though I don't have a huge collection of quilts, I should start taking this seriously. And so that leads me to my next question, which I think is going to be really fun. And I talked to Julie and Lynn about this just a little bit, Alden, before. And I think like a lot of people out there, I have some textiles, some quilts that were either I acquired as a collector or they were given to me. And I know very little about them. And I have started to have like waves of guilt, like I would leave these behind, and the next person would know even less, and then it would be gone. So I am going to share a couple of them, and you're going to see photographs. This is a quilt that I bought for my mother. My mother taught me how to quilt in the late 80s, and she loved quilts. And I was covering the business of the arts for the Wall Street Journal, and I was a regular reader of the Maine Antique Digest. And I saw this quilt for sale, this antique Amish crib quilt in the Maine Antique Digest. And so I bought it for her, and I've just taken a picture of it so you can see it. I've carefully tucked over the part where there are candle wax stains, because my mother had it and my dad had it on the wall next to their dining room table for years and years and years. So she loved it. But my question is, okay, I want to label that now and carry that information forward, but I don't know that much. What is your advice?
Well, was it sold to you as an antique?
Yes, that was what it said in the ad. And I don't recall, again, I wish I had that ad. I didn't think it was the first quilt that I ever bought. So I didn't write any of that down.
Well, yeah, the first thing would be at the time of purchasing, get as much information as you can, obviously, and that goes on. What the dealer tells you, or that you bought it at such and such a time from such and such a person. I happen to know that this is Lancaster County. This is an Amish quilt made in Lancaster County, or after a quilt from Lancaster County. And in this case, I happen to know that in Lancaster County, they did not make crib quilts during the classic period of 1880 to about 1950. So this was made later, even if it was made from older fabrics. And that just happens to be something that I know from my years and years and years as curator at Esprit and just studying Amish quilts. So if one thing you might do is look for the expert in the field of, in the genre that you're looking at. And I could tell you that this was almost certainly made after 1980.
Oh, that is great. But I should still label it, right?
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
and now you can label it and say Julie Silber, former curator of the Esprit collection of Amish quilts and an expert on Amish quilts, has noted that it is X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, I am so lucky. All right, so let's move to the next one. This is a sweet vintage quilt that I bought at a QSG seminar. It just had a little tag on it. I think there's another picture that shows the tag, and that was on it. I don't know who donated it to the sale. It probably cost me $25 or $30 or something. But that's what it says. Pine tree quilt, West Virginia origins, 1930, with great grapes and leaves quilting, and then the size. So what would you do? What would you want to put on a label? And do I keep that on there or just take a picture of it? I don't know. What's your advice?
I think it's a good idea to take a picture of it and keep that as part of the record. We talked about this before, and I think I suggested that in your own records, you would say said to have been made in West Virginia, because we don't know that. I think on a label, I would put that you bought it in an AQSG, American Quilt Study Group seminar, and what year. I do think that usually at American Quilt Study Group, was it a silent auction, I think, they often have the name of the donor. And if they do have the name of the donor, make note of it, find that person and see if they know any more than that about it.
I'm just thinking that, we're showing our skepticism here, that maybe we should tell our viewers what it takes for us to be more positive about where something is from, because we keep on saying said to be, it's got a label on it. It says West Virginia. Why are we so skeptical of that?
I don't know if we're specifically skeptical as much as because we're historians and we want to be transparent about how much we know and what we're confident about. We're hedging our bets. It's not that we're questioning the veracity of the person who wrote that label or where they bought it or whatever. We just don't absolutely know for sure. And so we're kind of hedging our bets. It's
Right.
like when I write a label that says, according to family history, this was by so-and-so, or this was the wedding dress of so-and-so. Now, maybe it's a dress that could have been a wedding dress because the date lines up. I've been able to find the marriage record, but we weren't there. We don't have a newspaper account saying the bride wore this particular dress. So it's a matter of hedging our bets rather than not believing somebody. I just want to throw that in.
As I can tell you that as a dealer, what I like to do is say found in, or origin unknown, found in, if I know where I bought it. This idea that it's there's nothing about the quilt in the images that we've seen so far that would verify that it was West Virginia, but knowing that somebody said it was West Virginia, there might be more to be found. For example, maybe somebody would just accidentally find, maybe it's signed somewhere or a date somewhere on the quilt. And then if you know that it's West Virginia, we might be able to line up the name with West Virginia or not.
Yeah. So you're giving me
So
which I, from what you were showing us earlier, is that I should just kind of get down on my hands and knees and really examine this just to make sure that there isn't any other identifying information or bordered in or whatever. And I will do that. That's also very good advice.
Right. So my point, I was just trying to get us to talk about what it is we look for that we really can sink our teeth into and say, yes, this is the correct history. So I was just looking for you, me, whatever, to talk about documentation through family records or photographs, or a stronger sort of oral history,
or a regional characteristic. This quilt is so late, it's 1930s, and it's a typical design, a classical design, pine tree of life. There's nothing that says regional West Virginia or anything else. It's so late in the game. But some of the early quilts, you really can see regional characteristics, and that would help you in an earlier quilt, that would help you set it.
Yeah, you may be able to find regional things. You may be able to date things by, if someone has a date range, you need to do some research on whether that style or pattern existed back then.
Fabrics.
And of course, fabrics. Barbara Brackman's Clues in the Calico helps you with that. There are other books and so on. Reading, Lynne showed the book she contributed to, Quilts in the Industrial Age. There's a second volume, Quilts in the Machine Age, which takes it into the next century. That shows many examples in the IQM, International Quilt Museum collection. You can compare with those. it's not an easy fix. It's not easy to just say, how am I going to look this up? I'm going to figure it out in half an hour of browsing
Right,
online.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
again, the more you read, the more you know, the more you learn about the style of prints and the development of dyes and all of that. And that, that's why it helps to ask a know-it-all, ask an expert.
Ask a know-it-all.
But which is not to say, do your own research. It's just, it's going to be hard to acquire all the little nuances.
Exactly. And also, you can go to a local, if the know-it-alls are not available or at your service, you can go to a local appraiser who has a good reputation. Well, I think we're going to have to wind down right now. I could go on with you guys forever because this is so much fun and your knowledge is so deep, but I can't wait to hear what the questions are. So let's open it up to questions now.
Okay. Wonderful discussion. Now I'll ask all of our panelists to rejoin me or to join me live for questions from the audience.
Lots of questions in the chat here. Do you want to moderate that, Amy? Or?
Yes, there are so many. Unless there's any that you see that you would like to jump on.
Amy.
Yes.
I just want to say how thrilled I am that I now have this mystery solved. I don't know if you had a chance to see the comments, but Debbie Cooney, who is in fact one of the 6 know-it-alls, has said in a remark that she donated that quilt. So I can now put on the label that was Debbie Cooney's quilt. So thank you, Debbie.
How cool! What a life!
She bought it.
Sorry, Alden.
And where she bought it.
Yes.
Right. Love it.
How cool. What a lively chat. I don't think I've seen such an excited and like rich chat stream in a long time. That speaks really volumes about what you've presented for us. And I see a couple questions that are similar. One is about if that quilt that you're labeling has more than one pattern name, or maybe maybe there are several people that make it. I think Julie made the point earlier of putting everything that you can think of that might need to be put on the quilt to just include it. What do you think about pattern names? Should you try to research it and add multiple pattern names? Should you add sketches?
Well, here's the good news. Here's the good news that Barbara Brackman has done years and years and years of research on pattern names. And in her book, The Encyclopedia of Piece Patterns, she has numbers. And if you can find the design and write down its number, it often has numerous names for the same pattern. So you could even put, we're starting to use Brackman number such and such. And then in that book, you can see, and sometimes the history of it, if it's a published pattern and so on.
We use, so if you're labeling your quilt and pattern, give whatever you name it, what do you know it as? Or is it, your own made up name? But we literally say Brackman number 3248 in our cataloging because it's the industry standard.
I can say for myself that putting the pattern name on the quilt is low on the priority list of all the information I'd like to see, because I can look that up if I want to. Although if you have a specific name for it, that would be great. And if you have a reason for why you call it that, that would be great. But I don't see a reason to put Brackman number, whatever.
No, when I brought that up as something to put on the label, I'm saying when you make a quilt, if you're documenting your own quilt, what are you calling it? That was what I was trying to get at.
Or if it's an older quilt, what did the family call it? Which
if known,
I think is fascinating. What name came down with it over the years.
And Julie, there's a question about paper documentation. You mentioned, you showed a slide where the paper was decaying and the ink was smudged. Someone is asking, Paula is asking, if a quilt that was inherited has paper documentation attached, should it be transferred or left attached to the quilt? How would you handle that?
I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer it, but I did see something in the chat as I was glimpsing through that you can put a piece of paper in plastic. You can slide it into a small plastic bag and attach that. So you might want to keep the old thing in plastic on the back of the quilt and maybe add your own label if you have additional information. That would be my take on that.
Right.
My take would be to leave it alone. Just leave it there and photograph it and include the photo with your documentation. But once labels have been taken off, they're too easily lost.
Yeah. Can
So
I
Lynn-
answer a question I see here scrolling through? Betsy Westover
Absolutely.
asked, how do you know if the name on the label is actually the person who made it or was made by a slave and given to the person whose name is on the label? That's a really, really good question. And beyond the possibility of an enslaved person having worked on it, you know, any quilt probably has had more than one hand working on it, because we know to what extent it was a communal activity. Maybe one person pieced it, but you know, almost certainly she had friends helping, not necessarily in the big, you know, romanticized quilting bee party, but people would drop by and quilt if there were neighbors around, or you had your daughters helping you or whatever. So, you know, often things are attributed to one person, but you can guess that other people were helping. We also, if you go to Barbara Brackman's Material Culture blog, she talks about this fairly often, that there are a lot of quilts in the early years that, you know, all these beautiful, beautiful chintz applique quilts were attributed to this one South Carolina person. Well, did she make them or did she maybe buy them? Is it the owner? Or is it the actual maker? And you know, sometimes
this might be
things
a
will
real
come down in
good,
the family with a history of, oh, Granny must have made this. Maybe she did, and maybe she didn't.
I was just thinking that this might be a good time to talk about how Zania Cord, one of our colleagues, has suggested that when you find a name or a date on a quilt, that we don't call it a signature, but rather we say it's inscribed, because it might be the person who made it, might be the recipient of the gift. And until we know for sure, and luckily we do have a few quilts that say made by in the inscription, so we know that, but any name on a quilt may or may not be the maker, and any date may or may not be the time the quilt was finished.
And
Right.
we actually all 5 of the 6 know-it-alls actually just the other day recorded our next episode 23, which is our February episode. And thank you for that. That was very quick. And we actually talk more about this, about inscribed quilts and some of the cautionary hints that this may be a previous owner, or it may be an old blanket that was reused as the backing. So, so you have to be cautious about what that name is.
Yeah. Well, I hate to end this. We could go on for another hour. I hope that you will check out the resource document, everyone. Emma, if you could add that to the chat box again, because that has the full length discussion and all of the contact information for our guests, our panelists are there so that you can follow up with them if you have an additional question. And definitely check out the Know-It-Alls programs. They are incredible. I've watched many while multitasking, watching while making dinner or something, but they are incredible.
And you know,
Sorry?
we're on Facebook too. We didn't get to every question, so we are on Facebook. You can say we have both the 6 know-it-alls and 6 know-it-alls show us your quilts.
Fantastic. So everybody look for them on Facebook. I think we included the link. And the next week's talk is by the International Quilt Museum, Black at Work, Engaging Youth Through Textiles and Art Making, right here on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And thank you so much, panelists.
What fun. Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for having
us. Thank you.
It's been
Thank you so much. Thank you, Meg. Wonderful moderating.
Thanks.
Thanks all. And we'll turn it over to Lucy.